Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. Yes, yesterday the second edition of the State of CDR report has been released in the afternoon, and of course it has over 200 pages, and you will not be able to read it by the end of the day, even after you put your new shoelaces on and followed all these presentations. It's a team of 50 authors. Most of the people leading this effort have been involved in the last IPCC report, and it takes an approach of assessing CDR regularly, but not waiting 6 or 7 years for the next report. And if you have seen the first report, I don't know if you have, you should have, you have seen a similar figure, because it started with, do we actually know how much carbon dioxide removal are we doing today? This was one of the improvements in the first State of CDR report, but also in the IPCC report, because quite often CDR was treated as a thing in the future. Do we really need it? How do we get there? And hey, but we're doing afforestation for quite some time, although we still do more deforestation than afforestation, and it's really hard to measure in terms of the accounting rules. And while last year we concluded we have roughly 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal already, the number is now a little bit higher, but most of it comes from what we called conventional methods. Conventional is afforestation, reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, but the so-called novel methods, direct air capture with storage, enhanced weathering, biochar, and all the others you can think of with lower TRL levels, not widely deployed, not in national inventories, they only make up a very, very tiny amount of that, 0.1%. So this also shows the way we have to go in the future. Christoph already presented some numbers. If you look at IPCC scenarios, they are a little bit different, but that should not concern us. The message is we need to get to multiple gigatons by mid-century, and thereafter it's even more increasing. On the upper panel you see just net CO2 levels for 1.5 with low overshoot, high overshoot, and for 2 degrees. They all go net negative during the century. But below we see conventional CDR, what we have right now. It will still grow a little until mid-century, but there are limits. There are limits because of the areas you would need, for example, for afforestation, reforestation, but also in a warming climate, there are limits in terms of durability, permanence. So the warmer it gets, the more extreme events you will have, and therefore it also goes down during the course of the century in these IPCC scenarios. And at the same time, panel C below to the right, novel CDR really increases then fastly and takes over the job. So while we can be happy that we already do some CDR, the novel CDR is yet to be written. And if you compare scenarios, and what I just showed you was, let's say, the medians of like 600, 700 scenarios in the IPCC database, it's sometimes useful to look at what scenarios are actually for, look at single scenarios, don't take averages, and take, let's say, marker scenarios, what we call it, in the report, also in the IPCC. Compare for 2030 and 2050 certain scenarios. They present a certain range here in 2050 from 5 to 10 basically, have certain characteristics. And what you see here in the light gray is what governments actually propose in their nationally determined contributions for 2030 and for 2050 in their long-term strategies. And the difference between those is the gap, and it's huge. And it's huge even if governments fulfill their pledges, which is usually not the case, as we all know. So this is what we call the CDR gap between proposed levels and what is needed to meet the Paris temperature goal. The Paris temperature goal is 1.5 to 2 degrees. So right now, as you all know, we heard that already, the voluntary market is, let's say, a major source of funding for CDR. It funds more conventional CDR than novel. The scales here are not the same, but the novel CDR, you see the year-on-year growth. And of course, you see that element that you have pre-purchases. So CDR already sold, but not delivered. And I think there's a consensus that the voluntary market alone will not be able to get us to gigaton scale. We have a whole chapter on the voluntary carbon market that we did not have in the first version of the report. If we look at company announcements, and of course that includes Climeworks, they are very ambitious. It's a logarithmic scale, so it's not, don't be confused by that. The company announcements we already have are in line with scenarios, but of course there's little basis for credibility in scale-up feasibility. This is not because companies cannot be trusted. Of course they have to also sell visions, but the question is more, where will the demand come from? Of course we have SBTI, we have company targets, and we will see how that goes, but we need policy-induced demand at gigaton scale. And it will of course look different in different countries, with different political cultures, with different kinds of climate policy. We also have chapter on that where we have case studies. In the first round we had Brazil, the EU, the US, and the UK. Now we broaden that as well to Japan, Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Japan. So other major forces in that race, as you know, the US, Canada, and Saudi Arabia are leading the so-called mission innovation on CDR. So we need policy-induced demand at gigaton scale to get to that kind of upscaling. What we also need in a robust global strategy, what you would also need in countries, within countries, is diversity. We already heard about that, to get to a more robust strategy. And if you look to the right, deployment and proposals, it's only gray. I mean, it's not 100% gray, but a 99.9% gray. It's conventional CDR. That's what we deploy today. But also if you look at the national determined contributions for 2030, as we have them, they have the same color. So not that many countries in their NDCs are really planning to do different things by 2030. If you look at some documents nationally, like the UK, like from the European Commission, you have indicative numbers to get into novel CDR, but they're only indicative. But if you look at other indicators, demonstration in upscaling, in investments, in high-value patents, in grant funding, research grant funding, and also in scenarios, you see the picture is much more diverse. But if you turn it around, you can say, okay, this emerging diversity is not really there yet in what countries are planning to do. Of course, in the UK, we have a very broad demonstration program. You can see it in the US as well already, but not in many other countries. So let's get to some key messages of the whole report, which is much broader. So limiting warming to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees, this is the so-called Paris long-term climate temperature goal, requires, of course, rapid and deep emissions reductions, but also near-term scale-up of CDR, 2.2 gigatons today to 7 to 9 gigatons by 2050, and then growing. We should never, ever really, I mean, I can understand why if you want to try to sell CDR, say, okay, this is the number we need to achieve by 2050. These are scenarios, they are dependent on many, many factors, on many, many assumptions, including on how fast we reduce emissions by 2050. But it really has to go up by many, many, many gigatons. And again, it does not stop in 2050. We see some novel CDR deployment already, but at a low level. To scale up CDR, we need more innovative activity. It needs to intensify. We see robust evidence for that in research, development, and demonstration, and we just heard an exciting and saw an exciting example about that. Another element we will need is not only policies, deliberate policies to scale up and develop CDR, define the place of CDR in national climate strategies, but we also need robust measurement, reporting, and verification. We have many protocols now on the voluntary carbon market by certifiers. We also have an MOV chapter in this report, but we also need it not only for broad portfolio of CDR methods, we will need it for the compliance market. And compliance regimes, we only have it for land-based conventional CDR right now, and these are not the most watertight rules we have for afforestation and forestry, but, and this is the good news, the member states of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, demanded, and the IPCC agreed at its last plenary, to set up a so-called methodology report for carbon dioxide removal technologies, which then allows, after being adopted by the UNFCCC, to put the effects of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, for example, by direct air capture or enhanced weathering or other methods, the scope has yet to be defined, on national inventories. So defining methodologies, this will be part of that, or the core of that methodology report, so that governments can actually put it onto their balance sheets. And as I've shown you already, there continues to be a gap between the amount of CDR in scenarios that meet the Paris temperature goal and the amount we see today in national proposals. So what do we have in the second edition? We have newer data, we have improved analysis, we also have a chapter on public perception, for example, on policy, on the CDR we're doing right now, on MOV, a whole chapter on the voluntary carbon market, but we also have a data portal that was not there in the first edition, and all of this is going to be expanded in the future, and I would like you to get involved, look at these data, look at the chapters, and if you think you find something questionable, don't be shy and get in contact. This is about improvement. And if you think you have something to contribute to this emerging expert community as well, please get in touch. There will be future editions of this report. There will also be a third generation maybe of this report in the future. And thank you very much for now. And now we move on to the fireside chat.
I think that many of you here in the audience know that 2024 is actually a record year also when it comes to voting. So more than half of the population, 4 billion people, are able to vote in over 60 countries. And you mentioned policy making. So let me ask you, in such a record year, what is needed from policymakers to help scaling up CDR?
Yeah, I think first of all, and there are concerns about many of these national or European elections. The European is happening on Sunday. Will, in a world of conflict and armed conflict, climate remain center stage? So let's hope for that and assume that it will. And in terms of carbon dioxide removal, I think, first of all, governments should make up their minds, and many haven't yet. What will the role of CDR in their overall climate strategy really be? So ask yourself, what kind of residual emissions do you think you're going to land at? let's say, at the year of net zero. It's often 2050. So what is the amount of CDR you will need to get to net zero at that point? It might be useful to signal that with split targets, one for emissions reductions, one for removals. I think it helps in many countries, but it depends a little on the political culture in the country to have these split targets. But it also helps with signaling. So for example, if you would have 10 or 15% of residual emissions, that's what European countries often count with, in the year of net zero, it becomes immediately clear the main task we have to do is drastically reduce emissions, because it would be 85 to 15, but at the same time put exact numbers then on these residual emissions and removals, because at least in large countries you will see the numbers in million tons that you have to achieve will be enormous, and you need to get going. So this is one thing, signaling, setting up priorities, bringing in what kind of methods you want to use and how you can do that. Also in an exchange with other countries, at least in the OECD countries, they are all thinking about that right now. So I think this is important, but at the same time what's important, a signaling on the global level, on the UNFCCC level. You might know that there is now a more technical UNFCCC conference running in Bonn that started on Mondays, going for 2 weeks. Next year, all countries have to present new nationally determined contributions for 2035, and then we should really expect to see some novel CDR in that. And third, because, and Christoph showed the numbers for the temperature increase we already see, although the 1.5 degrees target is defined as a 20-year average, it's pretty clear, and the IPCC report showed that even in that 20-year average logic, we will cross it in the first half of the 2030s. So if we then still want to talk about 1.5, then it means policymakers will have to embrace a strategy of getting to net negative emissions, because net zero CO2 stabilizes, net negative gets your temperature down again. But we don't have, apart from Denmark, not a single country that already says, okay, here is our net negative target. So Denmark says now minus 110% GHG by 2050. And I would expect at least every OECD country that says, okay, we're still aiming for 1.5, to say, okay, these will be our net negative targets. So this is a little bit concerning. Globally, we're counting on the world going net negative, but we don't even have governments promising it. And promising would just be the first step. Delivery would then be the next.
Thank you, Oliver. You also mentioned that the report has a chapter on monitoring, reporting, and verification. So why is MRV so important, and what is the role of the IPCC there?
So MRV is important because you want to know what you're doing. It will be important for setting up incentives for governments, but also for voluntary corporate targets. It will be important to know, okay, what kind of removal did we actually achieve? And on a state level or on a global level, it's simply important to acknowledge, okay, it's there. It's part of the official agenda. It's part of the official climate targets. I don't know if you have ever looked at a national inventory report. These are 900-page reports quite often, at least in the European Union. And you have inventory compilers in the government or in government agency tracking all these flows. And if you want to take CDR seriously, we also need to do that for methods like direct air capture with storage, for enhanced mineral weathering, for biochar, for direct ocean capture and storage, and all the others, simply to show, okay, we're doing it, we are confident enough to be able to account for it, but we can also verify what's going on. We will find out that some of the novel CDR methods are not so easy to monitor, report, and verify. And I think that will also play a big role. in what governments choose, but we will also see that in some cases we will need much more research going into MRV. And I think I can imagine that the difference will occur between a very straightforward method, for example, like direct air capture with storage, to methods where the CO2 in the end will go, for example, as bicarbonate into the ocean for enhancement of weathering, or if you do ocean alkalinity enhancement, where you would solely rely on modeling, which might create some tension in the public debate if you should really do that, putting that onto our national accounts, although everything we do already today in national inventories are approximations, even for very easy things like measuring transport emissions. So we can never expect it to be 100% exact, but we have to integrate these methods now into the official government accounting under the UNFCCC. And the IPCC, and it's kind of an esoteric strand of the IPCC, it's the task force on inventories who are working on methodologies, have started doing this in the 90s. The first big report that is still valid today is from 2006, and then they work on refinements. They do, and then on additions, they do one for short-lived climate forces now, but also one on CDR, on CCS, refining the CCS methodologies we already have since 2006, thinking about carbon capture and utilization. And again, governments need to ask the IPCC to do that, and they asked, and they came from very different camps, and it's a good sign because it shows, okay, governments actually want to do this, want to include it pretty soon, and ask the IPCC to come up with that methodology report by the end of 2027 already. Then it will take some years, unless the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, will actually adopt this, and then you can put it onto your national accounts. And I think for many countries, it will be much easier then to develop incentive schemes once it's clear how the methodologies will look like. But this will not render everything on MRV that happens on the voluntary market meaningless. There will always be a voluntary carbon market, and it's experience we need. You cannot come up with MRV rules from scratch without any further or any prior experience.
Thank you, Oliver. You said don't be shy to get into contact. You also mentioned, or you indicated a third generation of the report. Can you tell us a little bit what is coming next and how exactly the audience can engage with the report, how they can amplify it, and how we can support you?
So, of course, read the report, as I said, and get in touch, especially if you find something where you say, well, that might be a little bit questionable. It's the second report. It's not an easy task, not a trivial task to come up with the numbers. What are we actually doing right now? So it's really an issue of databases, bringing things together, but also there is, in the demonstration and upscaling part or the research development part, there's an analysis of patenting data, for example. So a lot to look into, but also to improve in future iterations of the report. Now that we also have the data portal, it's not clear yet when the next report will come out. As always, that also depends a little bit on who's financing it at which levels. But it might be that we use the data portal to do, for example, very specific analysis, let's say, for the next round of NDCs that are due in 2025 to recalculate these gaps, do technical papers on that, and then wait a little bit longer with the next big report. So that's open, but we really rely on your feedback in terms of, is it useful, what could be improved, what is missing, and if you see a role for yourself in that, we're happy to consider that as well. In the first round, we had, I think, like 20 orders. Now it's 50, and geographically much more spread. So we haven't made decisions on the next round, but I'm pretty sure there will be one.
Perfect. So please get in touch with Oliver and the team. So the Climeworkers, they ended on an optimistic note. And I also want to ask you, what makes you optimistic looking into the future?
Well, also a little bit of the history. So I was responsible in the last IPCC report, in the Working Group 3 report, for carbon dioxide removal. And when the work started, there was a lot of skepticism also among governments, because again, it's an intergovernmental panel on climate change, so you get a lot of government review. And if you see what has changed in the last 5 years on the ground, with companies like Climeworks, but also others, but also the number of people in governments involved in carbon dioxide removal, desk officers, specialists, strategies, the way they take it seriously, because they understood the very easy message that net zero already means you committed to CDR. Otherwise, you would say it's just zero emissions. It was kind of revealing for governments to learn that, but yeah, net zero means CDR. Now they start to work out what do we need to do in our country and what needs to happen globally. I think there's a big shift, and myself coming from Germany, the things we do right now in terms of allowing carbon capture and storage in general and transport, and now even having decided in the new climate law to have binding sub-targets for novel CDR from 2035 under a green Minister for the Economics and Climate. I would not have imagined that 3 years ago. So I think we can see progress in many countries. You could tell many similar stories in other countries. So my feeling is we're moving fast, but we should not think, okay, from here on it will just be easy. So I would say I'm hopeful because the public, the media and governments and many companies already as potential buyers are taking it seriously. You see a lot going on in the startup world, and you see actual projects emerging. We cannot say with any certainty where we will be at 2030, 2040, 2050, but I think we can be pretty confident that this sector is going to grow. And it's needed if we want not only to get back to 1.5, it's needed for any global climate target, because you only stop temperatures from rising if you get to net zero CO2, and as I already said, net zero means CDR, and the numbers on a global level will be considerable. So even if we miss 1.5 or 1.6, you need a lot of CDR for 1.7, for 1.8. So it's here to stay, and let's get started.
Okay, it's here to stay. Thank you so much, Oliver, and enjoy reading the State of the CDR report, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.